Good morning. My name's Alex Schadenberg. I'm the Executive Director of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. I'm here with Angelina Ireland. She's the Executive Director of the Delta Hospice Society. We obviously share a common goal, which is the protection of life throughout all its stages in the sense of at the end of life. So basically speaking, as Canadian citizens, members of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, we're calling on the federal and provincial governments to provide a complete review of Canada's medical assistance in dying MAiD law. The reason is it's never been done. We oppose MAiD being considered a form of medical treatment. We believe that MAiD is incompatible with and must be separate from palliative care. We support the traditional definition of palliative care that intends neither to hasten nor postpone death, and we support healthcare sanctuaries as a human right in Canada. So basically, this whole point that we're focusing on is on March 17, 2021, Bill C-7 passed. And when Bill C-7 passed, it expanded MAiD in Canada by removing the terminal illness requirement. It removed the 10-day reflection period in the law, and it created this two-tier law where if you're terminally ill, there's no waiting period, but if you are not terminally ill, there could be a 90-day reflection period, and it extended to these people for their euthanasia death. But on March 21st, 2025, Canada received a critical review by the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the CRPD, of our MAiD law. Among other concerns, the CRPD urged Canada to repeal the Track 2, the non-terminally ill allowance for MAiD. It also said that they rejected the concept of expanding MAiD for the sole underlying medical condition being mental illness. They also rejected the proposals to extend MAiD to mature minors and by advance requests. So we see this from the United Nations. We also then saw, which is very important why we need to look at our law and realize what's going on. On October 17, 2024, which last year, the Office of the Chief Coroner of Ontario released a report from the Ontario MAiD Death Review Committee. That report indicated that there were MAiD deaths that have been driven by homelessness, fear, and isolation in Ontario. The report also indicated that people living with poverty were at risk of coercion, that people with disabilities were needlessly dying by MAiD, and there were at least 428 non-compliant MAiD deaths in Ontario between 2018 and 2023. This needs further investigation. The MDRC report also proves that Supreme Court of Canada's Carter decision is not being followed. It's being violated because Carter required a carefully designed system that imposes strict limits that are scrupulously monitored and enforced. 428 non-compliant deaths means it's not being enforced and it's not scrupulous. On June 11, 2023, the Quebec government approved MAiD by advance request. Quebec's Justice Minister told the Crown Prosecution Office not to lay charges in the case of a euthanasia that was approved by an advance request. On October 28th, our own Canadian government's health minister announced that the federal government launched a national conversation on MAiD by advance request. So they're not actually looking at the MAiD law, they're looking at expanding it further. There have been many stories that have happened in Canada, and in the MDRC report, that's the Ontario report, looked at 6 specific stories and published them in the document. One of them actually dealt with someone who had no medical condition. So even when they did the autopsy of this person, this is after they died by MAiD, they found no medical condition. This person had pain, symptoms, etc., but no medical condition. The overwhelming majority of patients in Canada do not ask for MAiD, regardless of medical condition. We see this in the data very clearly. Publicly funded institutions should provide medical safe spaces that are not required. The optimal care for most Canadians is not to have MAiD because they don't want it. Furthermore, the presence from medical practitioners who support MAiD has led to complaints from people who are offered MAiD, even pressure to ask for it. Some people have expressed alarm when they've been offered MAiD on several occasions, even though they never expressed an interest in it. There are many stories of people who are living with disabilities, poverty, homelessness, and or loneliness who have felt pressure to choose MAiD. Hospice is being confused with MAiD. Many provincial governments have instituted MAiD within the hospice palliative care system. We respect the World Health Organization's definition of palliative care, which states palliative care intends neither to hasten nor postpone death. MAiD must be completely separate from palliative care. Canada's MAiD law is discriminatory. After Bill C-7 passed, the law became specifically oriented towards people with disabilities, that non-terminally ill condition. So what was left in the law was you had to have a grievous and irremediable medical condition. So you need to be 18, you need to be suffering, etc. But essentially it comes down to having a grievous and irremediable medical condition. The law approves death for one group of people while another group of people are offered suicide prevention. This is discriminatory. So we call on federal and provincial governments to provide a complete review of Canada's MAiD law. A complete review. It's not been done even though it was promised in the original law. It's just not been done. A complete review will enable a proper response to the issues Canadians face. It is unacceptable that the Ontario MDRC report identified 428 deaths that contravened the law, yet no attempted prosecutions occurred and no medical licenses were suspended. In fact, there are several doctors who were listed, who are not, none of the doctors' names are listed, but who had more than one contravention of the law, and yet they continue just to practice medicine without any problems. A complete review of the law requires input from all perspectives and without prejudice. Members of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition and Delta Hospice Society, we share these concerns. We call on the federal provincial governments to do this complete review of our MAiD law. Angelina Ireland is next. Thank you.
Alex. Ladies and gentlemen, do you want to live in a country where they send medical death teams to your home to euthanize you, but you can't even find a family doctor? Do you want to live in a country where they allow no-kill animal shelters, but you're not allowed to have a no-kill human shelter? My name is Angelina Ireland. I'm from the Delta Hospice Society. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a nurse. I'm a patient. I'm a cancer survivor. I've spent the last 10 years with the Delta Hospice Society. We built and created a hospice, spent $8 million to create a sanctuary for the dying, only to be taken from the provincial government because we refused to kill our patients. Ladies and gentlemen, we need healthcare sanctuary in this country. The Delta Hospice Society wants to provide a sanctuary to the people, to take care of them, so they will not be mated, and we are not allowed. We're not even asking for any money from the government. We will do this on our own, but we are not allowed. We are asking for healthcare sanctuary in Canada. You see, the world can see what's going on in Canada. It's an embarrassment. But yet we are not allowed to have sanctuary in this country. This is a human right. We are being denied. The problem, of course, is that after Carter, where they only granted access to people to have MAiD, it is now being compelled. It is being compelled across the entire medical system. If you're in a hospital, if you're in long-term care, if you're in a hospice. In fact, you can get mated in a funeral home. You can get mated in a park. What you can't get is any ability to hide from a predatory MAiD regime that has been created. We're asking for sanctuary. We have story after story. My colleague Alex has told you there are hundreds of people who've been mated ineligibly and nothing is happening. In fact, MAiD providers are acting with impunity. MAiD providers are being granted millions of dollars to produce publications like this one that I'm showing you right here, which in fact instructs doctors in our countries and nurses in our countries that they have an obligation to bring up MAiD to their patients. We consider this counsel to suicide. That is against the criminal code, and nothing is happening. The Delta Hospice Society has to go out and create cards for people to carry with them to the hospital, which says, I require health care, not MAiD, so they will not be attacked, so the elderly will not be attacked when they get into the emergency wards, as we have documentation trying to convince them to MAiD themselves, when all they need is health care. MAiD is being solicited, MAiD is being recruited for, and we want sanctuary. What we're asking is for the Canadian people to stand with us and to demand sanctuary spaces, to allow the Delta Hospice Society to once again have a hospice and not be shut down by the government. This is what it is to be Canadian. To be compassionate is not to kill. To be compassionate is to take care of the weak and the vulnerable among us. We ask you to call the Delta Hospice Society 1-800-232-1589. Get your own card. Get your own customized card to carry in your wallet to protect yourselves. We ask you to call and tell us your stories, what's happened to you inside of the medical system. What we need is a grassroots movement for hospice and healthcare sanctuary. And I know the Canadian people will support me. Thank you very much for your time today.
Okay, this is for Alex, Megan Gilmore, Canadian Affairs. You said that you call on both the provincial, territorial, and federal governments to conduct a full review of the MAiD law. I was just wondering, what would that review look like, and how is it different for like the federal government to conduct a review and then the provincial, territorial governments to conduct a review?
Well, the federal government doing a review would then look at the whole law, how it's being implemented throughout Canada, and it is very varied throughout Canada. But you might notice, Megan, that last year there was a review done in Alberta. Now, we haven't seen the end result of that. I'm not sure what the Alberta government's going to decide to do yet or not, but they did a review. They brought together people from all, parts of the medical system, et cetera, to look at what is happening in Alberta. So that's one province that has done that. If you look at Ontario as an example, they have the Ontario Coroner's Office does have this MAiD Death Review Committee, but it's only looking at post-deaths. Someone has died. They're only looking at that. And then on top of that, they're in a situation where they're just telling the stories of here's the information, here's what we have, etc. But that's not actually a review as to why it's happening or why there were 428 non-compliant deaths. For more information, like Quebec actually has what you call a euthanasia commission, but once again, it produces a report that's looking at only the post-death results of the law. It's not actually looking at why you're having these things go on, and this is the kind of thing we have to look at, the full review, and it has to be done in a totally open manner, that it's not judgmental. What we've had in Canada so far federally is committees that have looked to expand the law. Even though the original law, Bill C-14, had in it on the bottom, they added that requirement that the law be fully reviewed. That full review never happened. In fact, when they finally did a review, it wasn't a review, it was to expand the law. And in February of 2023, the federal government came up with a report saying we needed to expand euthanasia to mature minors and by advanced request. So they weren't looking at what was happening in the law, they were looking at expansions of the law. So that review's never happened as was required by the law originally. Finally, right now in Quebec, there's a coroner's inquest into the death of Norman Munier, and you probably have read about it. But anyway, Norman had bed sores after being he was in the emergency department for several days, not put on a proper mattress. He's a man who had been a quadriplegic, so he needed to be on a proper mattress. He then developed these bed sores. He ended up dying by MAiD. Well, how did that ever happen in the first place? MAiD becomes then the response to a medical tragedy, because it's a medical tragedy what happened to Norman Munier. He wasn't properly cared for. We recently had a story. Actually, you might want to comment on some of this too, Angelina. Sorry.
Well,
Full review.
What would that look like? Like what are you hoping?
Well, we would want there to be an opportunity for people from all over Canada, from all points of view, to be able to express their understanding of what's going on, their own personal experiences, etc. I think it's very important because it's very difficult right now for a family or someone who has close medical experience with these cases to be able to come forward and say, this is what's happened. There really isn't an avenue for that. So whether you're in favor of or opposed to MAiD, it gives people an opportunity to express this is what's going on with the law right now. And I think that this needs to happen. I'm not saying that it should be focused on limiting the law or not. I'm just thinking let the stories come out and let them, without judgment, decide how this law is working and then how it needs to change, because in fact it's not working.
Angela, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, it's very important that we be given protection, which we have none right now. There are people who don't want to have anything to do with MAiD, right? That their choice is to have health care and to have that end-of-life journey where it is an authentic and historically accurate palliative care model. My organization is a 34-year palliative care organization, and we are very committed to that medical discipline of 50 years, yet we are not allowed to operate. And so, we need to have protections written into the law hospice protection spaces, MAiD-free spaces that people can go and understand that they're just going to have health care and they're not going to be harassed, because we have harassment. We have a system, a MAiD machine that has gotten completely out of control, and it needs to be brought back. It needs to be clawed back. There needs to be protections for the Canadian people, because we're suffering. And our people are frightened to go to hospitals. They're frightened to go to hospices. And that has to end.
We got a phone call from one of our supporters, and this woman called me up, and her husband was in the hospital. He was quite elderly. He was quite ill. He was approaching death. There was no question about any of that. And she was saying, how do we get the doctors to stop asking my husband if he wants MAiD? That was the question to me. She said that he's been asked 5 times and he said no each time, and he continues to be asked. So at what point does it become harassment? At what point does someone who's going through a difficult time, who might be going through a lot of, they might be becoming quite depressed, they might be going through a lot of emotional, difficulties. At what point does someone start saying, well, maybe I should be asking for MAiD because they've been asked over and over again? What about people with disabilities? So we've had quite a few cases, and you see that actually in the Ontario report. The woman who had multiple chemical sensitivities, who dies by MAiD, and the euthanasia lobby, the death lobby, they're saying, oh, well, she had asked for it. She wanted this. Well, the question is, why did she ask for it, and who approved her for this, knowing that she did not have an irremediable medical condition, and when what she needed was proper housing? She needed proper housing and proper supports. That's what she needed. But instead she got MAiD, euthanasia. That's what she got. So, it's actually becoming quite ridiculous if you start thinking about how far it's gone. The other thing about it has been significant funding for that euthanasia lobby. Significant funding, and it's given them an opportunity. They've had an open ear from our previous government, and I'm hoping this government is going to say, let's be more open to asking what's actually happening, rather than just taking a one-sided point of view, which is what we've seen for the last several years.
Yeah. If I might add about the funding, please, if I might add just for one moment. The Delta Hospice Society had $8 million taken from us, stolen from us. Yet the federal government gives organizations millions and millions of dollars to push MAiD onto vulnerable people. Something has to change.
Okay, here. So I just have some follow-up questions about funding, particularly, Angelina. So first, you held up a document earlier and you read from it. Just for people who may be watching online or weren't able to see it, I was just wondering, what document were you holding up? What is that?
This is a document that was published by Canadian Association of MAiD Assessors and Providers, known as CAMAP. This is a document, it's called Bringing Up Medical Assistance in Dying as a Clinical Care Option. This is a 15-page document. This is no doubt taken from the money given to them by the federal government. They got $5.5 million to create publications that they give to every doctor and every nurse across Canada, basically making the argument they have an obligation. It even says in here, obligation, to bring up MAiD to their patients.
So this document that you're reading from, that is separate from the model practice standard that CAMAP produced for Health Canada that was published a couple years ago.
Yes, and I'm going to give this to you. You're going to see it. You can read all the horror in here. This is why people who have cancer, my friends who have had cancer, have been approached by their doctors. Do you want MAiD? Right? It's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be patient-driven. It is not being patient-driven. It's being doctor-driven.
And then, because I know there's been a long history with your society and the BC provincial government. So for the sake of us who aren't in British Columbia, can you just explain to us a little bit about what currently is the status of the Delta Hospice Society? Are you still running the 10-bed hospice? What was going
So
on?
in 2021, the provincial government basically took our hospice from us via the Fraser Health Authority. We spent $8 million to build a hospice, 10-bed hospice in a 7,500 square feet palliative care center. We got in on a lease, on a 35-year land lease. When MAiD came in, the Fraser Health Authority said to us that we have to start providing MAiD. or we can't have any funding. We were getting $1.5 million of our $3 million budget inside of our palliative care program. They said, if you don't provide MAiD, you can't have any money. To which we said, that's fine, we don't want your money, we don't need your money. We want to operate here an authentic palliative care program. Apparently that's the wrong answer because they canceled our lease. Almost 25 years left on that property. And they canceled our lease and they evicted us from the property because we refused to kill our patients. Not only that, they evicted our patients, dying people in their beds, from the hospice. They gave them 2 months to get out. Either they were going to leave or they would be carted off somewhere to another hospice in the Fraser Valley, Fraser Authority. It came, they were taken away. We were evicted from our property. 2 weeks later, the Fraser Health Authority walked in and took our hospice and operates it to this day with the same name, the Irene Thomas Hospice that we gave it. Because we would not institute a MAiD program inside of our palliative care facility, because everybody has to. It's being compelled across the board. So now we have no bricks and mortar, but we still have an organization, and we still fight to create another sanctuary, of which we're not allowed.
And then, you were making the argument that publicly funded healthcare in Canada needs to include MAiD-free spaces, or we call MAiD-free sanctuaries. What would you say to the argument that because MAiD was legalized through a Supreme Court of Canada decision, which led to the change in the criminal code, what about the argument that because of these legal decisions, publicly funded healthcare in Canada needs to comply with the law and have MAiD?
Well, the law is access. The law is not in every single bed across this country, right? That is not the law. But they've taken the law and they've twisted it and manipulated it. What we're saying is that we're providing health care. In fact, we're not even asking for any money. We don't even need public funding. We can do this on our own. But still, we are not allowed.
I was going to make a comment on that, Megan, and I know we're almost up in time, but the federal government legalized MAiD in Canada, and you can see that in our criminal code, how they did it. They created an exception in the criminal code to homicide. So you see that right in the criminal code. You have it's in the Homicide Act. And so this is what you call, it's an exception. That's why it was done through our justice ministry, and then it's been done through doctors and nurses. So that's the healthcare side, nurses practitioners, that is. But it's not actually defined then as a healthcare, even though it's been deemed to be that in a sense. It's not actually defined that way. So the question of access is one issue. The second question is, why do all institutions then have to provide it? This is called an exception in the criminal code. It's not done through our Ministry of Health. That's not how they legalized it. They did it not through healthcare regulation. They did it through creating an exception in the criminal code. So as much as I oppose MAiD, I agree absolutely with the Delta Hospice Society that you need to have options for everyone, which would include MAiD-free spaces, sanctuaries. And obviously speaking, in the case of the Delta Hospice Society, they were more than happy to fundraise for themselves to keep the institution open for people who would want it. So.
Thank you. This concludes the press conference. Merci. C'est ce qui conclut cette conférence.
Thank you.